Welcome to the History Maps podcast. So, a captive is taken from the Eurasian steppes, trafficked across continents, and trained for a single purpose. And that purpose is warfare.
Right. They have absolutely no local heritage, no family connections, and definitely no royal bloodline.
Exactly. Yet, this enslaved soldier overthrows an entire dynasty. They seize control of one of the wealthiest empires on Earth, and they're suddenly facing a city of 500,000 subjects who are, all acutely aware that this new ruler is entirely illegitimate.
Right, because to survive in that scenario, you have to prove you belong. And when you don't inherit power through blood, well, you have to manufacture in stone.
You are forced to engineer a massive, undeniable visual legacy. You have to convince this enormous skeptical population that your rule is not just some temporary military coup. It has to look like a permanent, divinely sanctioned institution.
And the way you do that is by constructing monuments so massive and intricate that they literally physically alter the reality of the city around them.
Which brings us to our focus for this deep dive. We're looking at a stack of architectural journals, historical texts on Islamic Cairo and Jerusalem, detailed walking tours, and some really dense studies on fractal geometry and masonry.
Yeah, we are doing a comprehensive exploration of Mamluk architecture, spanning from 1250 to 1517.
We're going into the mechanics of how a caste of formerly enslaved soldiers transformed dense urban spaces, weaponized charitable endowments, and push the boundaries of stonemasonry. So let's start with the baseline identity of the Mamluks. The term itself means owned or property, right? Referring to this military caste of emancipated, enslaved soldiers.
Right, and they were primarily of Turkic and Circassian origin. Young boys were purchased from regions around the Black Sea and the Caucasus, brought into the Islamic world, and placed in these rigorous military barracks.
And their training was exhaustive. I mean, cavalry tactics, archery, Islamic theology.
Exactly. And upon completing their training, they were emancipated.
Yeah.
So they formed this elite, highly disciplined military force that was loyal strictly to their commanders and to their comrades.
But then, in 1250, the dynamic inverted entirely. They were serving the Ayyubid dynasty in Egypt. The Ayyubid sultan dies, a political vacuum opens up, and instead of serving a new master, these emancipated soldiers just seize the throne in Cairo.
Yeah, they just take over. And this military takeover kicks off a period of rule that lasts all the way until the Ottoman conquest in 1517. And we generally divide this era into two primary phases based on where the ruling factions were garrisoned.
Right, so first we have the Bahri Mamluks.
Yes, from 1250 to 1382, Bahr refers to a large body of water in Arabic, and these troops were barracked on the island of Rhoda, which is right in the middle of the Nile River.
And then following them, from 1382 to 1517, we have the Burji Mamluks.
Correct. Burg means tower, and that refers to the elite regiments who were quartered high up in the defensive towers of the Cairo citadel.
So you have a foreign military caste holding the most powerful seat in the Middle East. Their legitimacy is incredibly precarious. And I want to unpack the sheer necessity of their architectural output, because in the mid-13th century, right as they are taking power, the geopolitical map is fracturing completely.
Oh, absolutely. The Mongols are sweeping across Iraq and Iran, completely devastating traditional centers of Islamic culture and political power.
Right, and that triggers an enormous refugee crisis. Populations are fleeing westward toward the relative safety of Egypt.
And among those tens of thousands of refugees were master craftsmen, stonemasons, calligraphers, and artisans. So the Mamluks suddenly found themselves hosting this vast, displaced pool of top-tier talent from Persian, Syrian, and even Andalusian traditions.
But wait, having craftsmen is one thing, but organizing them into a unified architectural machine is another. How did a group of soldiers who were really trained only for war know how to direct this massive influx of talent?
Well, they leveraged highly organized systems of patronage, which were driven by intense internal competition.
The sultans and the high-ranking emirs, the top military commanders, they were in a perpetual race for status, right?
Exactly. Funding a monumental building was the ultimate display of power. In the early Bahri period, the architecture was heavy and defensive. The craftsmen utilized a lot of tricks, drawing heavily on those older Ayyubid traditions.
You see these massive hypostyle halls, vast prayer spaces with flat timber roofs supported by dense forests of columns. It felt very rooted, grounded, and slightly conservative.
But when we move into the Burji period, after 1382, the material reality of the buildings completely changes. It stops being about brick and timber and transitions almost entirely to finely cut stone.
Because the wealth available to the Burji Mamluks increased, and the technical skill of the masons evolved over generations.
Right. We see the emergence of highly complex, slender stone structures. The focus shifts toward intense surface ornamentation, verticality, and an almost exclusive use of precisely cut ashlar masonry. They were no longer just building walls, they were turning stone into lace.
I mean, that is a massive shift. Let's talk about the psychological imperative here. We mentioned their lack of a bloodline. They needed the public to see them not as foreign usurpers, but as the ultimate orthodox defenders of the faith.
And that narrative solidified because of two monumental military victories. In 1260, the Mamluks did what no one else had managed to do.
Right, they halted the Mongols.
Yes, they halted and defeated the Mongol advance at the Battle of Ain Jalut in the Levant. And then later, in 1291, they captured Acre, formally expelling the last of the Crusaders from the region.
So by securing those specific victories, they positioned themselves as the absolute saviors of Sunni Islam. Their architecture had to physically project that specific monumental status.
Which naturally raises a massive logistical question for us to look at.
Right.
We're talking about complexes that cover thousands of square meters, built of imported stone, heavily carved, and staffed by hundreds of religious scholars. So how are they paying for all of this?
Right, the economics of it. Because the financial foundation of the Mamluk Empire was built on a trans-regional trade monopoly.
Exactly. They controlled the primary geographic choke points of the global economy. The Red Sea and the Indian Ocean corridor connecting to the Mediterranean.
We are talking about the spice trade here.
Specifically, luxury goods flowing from South and East Asia toward the markets of Europe. Every shipment of silk, incense, and especially black pepper, which, became a massive global commodity after 1400, had to pass through ports like Alexandria or overland routes controlled by Cairo.
And the Mamluks levied heavy transit taxes on all of it. Plus, in addition to the international trade, they controlled the agricultural wealth of the Nile Valley, operating these massive, highly lucrative state monopolies on refined sugar.
Right. The capital flowing into the state coffers was staggering.
I want to break down exactly how that state capital was translated into public architecture, because it wasn't just a simple transaction of paying a builder. They used a specific legal and financial mechanism called the waqf.
The waqf is crucial here. It's an inalienable charitable endowment established under Islamic law. To understand Mamluk architecture at all, you really have to understand the mechanics of a waqf.
So a patron, let's say, a wealthy military commander, decides to build a hospital and a school. To ensure this complex operates after it is built, the patron legally binds revenue-generating assets to it in perpetuity.
Exactly.
Walk me through the physical mechanics of that. I build the hospital. What assets am I actually tying to it?
Well, the patron might own massive tracts of agricultural land in the Nile Delta, or commercial real estate in the city, so perhaps an urban bathhouse, a block of tenement apartments, or a series of shops in the central market.
Okay, so active businesses and farms.
Right. And the legal document, which is called the washia, stipulates that the rental income and agricultural yields from those specific properties must permanently fund the salaries of the doctors, the stipends for the students, the upkeep of the building, and the food for the poor.
But the sources suggest there is a highly calculated, slightly cynical political strategy operating beneath the surface of this charity, because Mamluk successions were incredibly volatile. You might be the Sultan's favorite commander today and executed for treason tomorrow.
That is exactly the reality of Mamluk politics. When an official fell from grace, the state immediately confiscated all their private wealth and property. They would seize your private assets upon your death or disgrace, leaving your family entirely destitute.
But under Sharia law, property placed into a waqf was legally classified as belonging to God, so the state could not confiscate it.
No, they couldn't touch it.
This operates almost like a medieval version of an untaxable offshore trust.
In many ways, it does. By establishing a waqf, a Mamluk elite could effectively shield a significant portion of their wealth from government seizure. Because while the revenues technically belonged to the charitable foundation, the patron was legally allowed to appoint the administrators of the waqf.
Oh, so they write into the foundational document that their son and their son's son will perpetually hold the position of chief administrator.
Yes, and that position came with a substantial, legally protected salary drawn from the endowment's revenues.
Wow. I mean, that is a huge legal loophole.
It really was. It allowed these commanders to secure a financial future for their descendants, insulate their wealth from political volatility, and simultaneously put on a massive public display of civic generosity.
The sources detail Sultan Qalawun's complex, built in 1284, as a prime example of this financial machinery in action. He constructed a massive hospital known as a bimaristan right in the center of Cairo.
Right, and the endowment document tied the revenues of specific agricultural villages in Syria, along with commercial properties in Damascus, directly to this hospital.
Because those assets were legally locked into the Waqf, that hospital provided free, highly specialized medical care to the public for centuries after Qalawun's death.
Yeah, the economics dictated the longevity of the architecture. But we also have to consider the physical environment where they were deploying this capital. Cairo in the 14th century was not an empty canvas. It was one of the largest, most heavily congested urban centers on the planet.
The population estimates place Cairo at roughly 500,000 residents before the Black Death arrived in 1348. To put that in perspective, if we look at the accounts of travelers like Ibn Battuta, who visited in 1326, the descriptions of the crowding are intense.
He describes residential tenement buildings reaching 10 to 14 stories high.
Right. The streets were described as being thick as locusts with merchants, camels, and pedestrians. The architecture leaned so heavily over the narrow alleys that certain streets were in perpetual twilight.
The urban density was just extreme, and the Mamluks concentrated their most ambitious building projects along the Kasaba, which was the main commercial spine of the city.
They specifically targeted an area known as Bain al-Qasrain, meaning between the two palaces.
Yes. To insert their monumental complexes, they systematically demolished the sprawling, older palaces of the previous Fatimid dynasty.
But here is the architectural problem that creates. You are a Mamluk patron. You want to build a massive, rigid, geometrically perfect religious institution. A mosque or a madrasa has to adhere to strict internal symmetry.
Right, because of religious requirements.
But the plot of land you just cleared is locked into a jagged, organic street grid that twists and turns. How do you fit a perfectly symmetrical building into an asymmetrical, highly congested urban footprint without destroying the flow of the city?
Well, you cannot alter the street grid, so you have to manipulate the architecture. The architects developed a highly sophisticated spatial transition known as the bent entrance, or madkal maqsid.
Oh, okay, break that down for me.
The primary religious constraint is the qibla, the mandatory direction of prayer toward Mecca. The interior prayer halls must be perfectly aligned with the qibla. However, the bustling commercial street outside almost never aligned with that axis.
Right, if they just built a square box aligned to Mecca, the corners of the building would jut out awkwardly into the street. It would create dead spaces, block traffic, and waste incredibly valuable commercial real estate on the ground floor.
Exactly. To solve this, the architects severed the alignment of the exterior from the interior. They built the massive exterior facade so that it perfectly hugged the irregular winding line of the street.
Oh, so the outside wall just follows the crooked street?
Yes. This maximized the commercial space, allowing shops to be built into the base of the monument, and ensured the building presented a flush, towering visual statement to the passing crowds.
I'm trying to visualize the experience of actually walking into one of these structures.
You step off the chaotic, noisy street through a monumental portal, but you do not step directly into the main prayer hall. Instead, you enter a transitional corridor.
And this corridor is deliberately designed to physically turn you.
Right. You might take a sharp left, walk a few paces, take a slight right, perhaps ascend a small flight of stairs. The architecture is physically rotating your orientation.
So by the time you emerge from this dark, twisting corridor into the main sunlit courtyard, the street outside is completely forgotten. You are now standing in a perfectly symmetrical space, flawlessly aligned with the Qibla.
The sources point to the funerary dome of Emir Khair Bek, which was constructed much later in 1502, as an absolute masterclass in this technique.
Right. The dome and its supporting drum were precisely rotated to face Mecca. But the architect manipulated the angles of the entrance walls so that a pedestrian walking down the narrow, crooked alleyway outside would experience a perfectly framed, monumental view of the complex.
It's brilliant. The building accommodates the chaos of the city while maintaining total internal order. And this approach allowed the Mamluks to weave massive civic infrastructure directly into the existing urban fabric.
And because real estate was so valuable, they did not waste space building standalone mosques. They pioneered the multifunctional complex. They packed an enormous amount of civic utility into a single dense footprint.
Let's break down the anatomy of a standard Mamluk complex. It functions almost like a self-contained neighborhood. You have the madrasa, which is a theological college focused on Islamic jurisprudence.
You have the mausoleum, the grand domed tomb for the patron.
There is often a khanqa, which served as a residential lodge for Sufi mystics. As we saw with Qalawun, there could be a bimaristan, a fully staffed hospital, and almost universally you find the Sabil Kutab.
The Sabil Kutab is such a striking architectural pairing of public services. The Sabil occupied the ground floor, featuring large bronze window grills facing the street. Inside, attendants would distribute free, clean drinking water to anyone passing by.
And directly above the Sabil, on the second floor, was the Kutab. This was an elementary school, often specifically funded to educate orphan boys in reading, writing, and reciting the Quran.
It is a physical manifestation of a specific theological principle, providing water to the thirsty and knowledge to the uneducated, operating simultaneously on a busy street corner.
When you move deeper into the complex, specifically into the madrasa, you encounter the standard spatial layout of the era, which is the cruciform, or 4i1 plan.
Help me visualize this 4i1 layout.
You stand in an open-air central courtyard, usually paved in intricate marble. Opening onto this courtyard on all four sides are massive vaulted halls. These halls are called iwans.
Okay, so they have 3 solid walls, but the fourth side is entirely open to the central courtyard. The layout creates a cross shape.
Yes, and the design is deeply tied to Mamluk political ideology. Each of the 4 iwans was dedicated to teaching one of the 4 orthodox schools of Sunni Islamic jurisprudence, the Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, and Hanbali schools.
So by housing all 4 schools under a single roof surrounding a shared courtyard, the patron was making a physical statement about the unity and supremacy of Orthodox Sunni Islam.
Exactly. That covers the educational space. I want to talk about the funerary space, the mausoleum. In many cultures, a tomb is placed in a quiet, secluded location far removed from the noise of daily life.
But the Mamluks did the exact opposite.
They engineered their tombs for maximum public visibility. The patron mandated that the mausoleum be built adjacent to the street, usually occupying the most prominent corner of the entire complex.
The walls facing the street were pierced with massive windows, covered only by iron or bronze grills. If I am the patron, why do I want the noise and dust of a medieval street filtering into my tomb?
Because you need the public to hear what is happening inside. The Waqf endowment we discussed earlier paid for a dedicated staff of readers to sit inside the mausoleum and continuously recite the Quran in shifts, 24 hours a day.
Right, so by placing the tomb on the street edge with open grills, the patron ensured that every merchant, student, and traveler walking past would hear the recitation. The architecture is literally designed to harvest public prayers.
Exactly. The auditory bleed into the street served as a constant reminder for the public to pause and offer a prayer for the soul of the patron. The building actively managed the spiritual legacy of the founder, integrating their memory into the daily acoustic landscape of the city.
If we want to examine the absolute pinnacle of this complex building endeavor, we really have to look at the Mosque Madrasa of Sultan Hassan.
Yes, the construction ran from 1356 to 1361. The dimensions are just staggering. It covers nearly 8,000 square meters.
The entrance portal alone is a massive recessed arch towering over 20 meters high. It looks less like a standard mosque and more like an impenetrable fortress of faith.
But the context of Sultan Hassan's project is vital. Construction began shortly after the Black Death swept through Cairo. The plague decimated the population, wiping out entire families and heavily disrupting the economy.
However, because of the massive death toll, vast amounts of inherited wealth, land, and property rapidly concentrated into the hands of the survivors and the state.
The economic landscape was entirely warped. There were fewer people, but the state suddenly controlled massive pools of consolidated capital.
And Sultan Hassan utilized that highly specific economic environment to fund an architectural behemoth.
The sheer scale of the complex was a calculated political broadcast. It was the state declaring to the surviving population that despite the catastrophic plague, the empire was unshakable, wealthy, and fully capable of executing monumental engineering feats.
And the crowning feature of these complexes, the element that truly redefined the skyline of Cairo, was the dome. The evolution of the dome from the early Bahri period to the late Burji period is a massive leap in structural engineering.
Early on, they were building relatively low, squat domes using brick, which is lighter and easier to manage.
But eventually, they abandoned brick entirely and began constructing massive domes out of pure stone.
And transitioning to solid stone completely changes the structural mechanics. The weight increases exponentially. Yet, during the Burji era, masons were pushing stone domes up to 16 meters in diameter.
Here is the statistic from the sources that really stops me in my tracks. The thickness to span ratio of these later stone domes dropped to merely 2%. To give you an idea of what that actually means physically, a standard chicken eggshell has a thickness to span ratio of roughly 2%. These masons were building massive, heavy stone vaults the size of modern houses and engineering them to be proportionately as thin as an eggshell.
It's incredible. The precision required to cut and fit those heavy stone blocks without the entire structure collapsing inward is difficult to comprehend. It requires absolute mastery of ashlar masonry.
But building the thin shell is only half the problem. The critical engineering challenge of any dome is how you support it.
Right, you have a massive immense downward and outward thrust of a circle into the straight, vertical, right-angled walls of a square.
How did they physically bridge that gap? I mean, you can't just rest a circle on a square without the corners caving in.
The foundational solution, adapted from earlier Persian and Roman techniques, is the squinch. A squinch is essentially a small arch or semi-dome built diagonally across the upper corners of the square room.
So by bridging the four corners, the squinch turns the top of the square room into an octagon. An octagon provides a much more stable, continuous base for a circular dome to rest upon.
That makes sense structurally, but visually it is quite abrupt. You have flat walls suddenly interrupted by chunky corner arches. The Mamluks pushed this further, developing highly sophisticated pendentives.
And this brings us to one of the most defining visual elements of Islamic architecture, muqarnas.
A pendentive serves the same structural purpose as a squinch, transitioning the square to a circle, but it does so in a smooth, continuous curve. The Mamluks filled these transitional zones with muqarnas.
For someone who has never seen muqarnas, the best way I can describe it is looking up into a complex three-dimensional honeycomb or a cluster of geometric stalactites cascading down from the ceiling. It is entirely fractal.
Muqarnas consists of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of small interlocking carved niches stacked in complex tiers.
Structurally, this cellular cluster acts as a brilliant load distributing device, doesn't it?
Yes, it takes the massive, concentrated weight of the dome and fractures it, funneling the load gradually and evenly down into the corners of the room.
Furthermore, because a muqarnas vault is composed of many small, interlocking stone elements rather than massive rigid blocks, it is highly flexible. It acts as an incredibly effective shock absorber in a region prone to earthquakes.
I understand the structural benefit perfectly, but I cannot get past the logistics of construction. You are a mason in the 15th century. You do not have drafting software. You do not have calculators. You are standing on a wooden scaffold 15 meters above a marble floor.
Right. How do you physically carve a fractal stone pattern that relies on repeating mathematical slices in multiples of 4, 8, or 16 and ensure it all perfectly aligns?
It was not done by trial and error on the scaffold, that much is certain. It relied on a highly advanced practical tradition of applied geometry. The master masons utilized complex two-dimensional projections.
So they would take a large flat surface, often a plaster-coated board on the ground, right?
Yes. Using only a compass and a straight edge, they would draft an intricate radial geometric grid. They were essentially drawing a highly complex blueprint.
They would then analyze that flat two-dimensional grid and extract specific geometric shapes from it. Each flat shape corresponded to a specific three-dimensional block type of niche, a vault, a connecting piece.
The individual stones were meticulously carved on the ground based on these templates. Once carved, the blocks were hoisted up the scaffolding and assembled layer by layer, locking together like a massive three-dimensional geometric puzzle.
If the initial radial grid drafted on the plasterboard was accurate, the final three-dimensional vault would fit perfectly.
The confidence required to execute that is just staggering. And we see that same geometric confidence applied to the exterior of the domes as well.
Initially, the stone domes were plain, or featured basic vertical ribbing. But eventually, the masons began carving complex patterns directly into the exterior stone shell.
They started with zigzags, moved to twisting spirals, and finally achieved interlacing geometric star patterns. Carving a continuous, mathematically rigid star pattern across a curving convex surface is an immense technical challenge.
Right, because if the stonemason's calculation is off by a fraction of an inch at the base of the dome, by the time they carve the pattern all the way up to the apex, the lines will completely fail to intersect. The geometry forces perfection.
And this intense focus on surface manipulation extends beyond the domes. It defines the entire aesthetic language of the Mamluk Empire. They used very specific decorative techniques to project a cohesive visual identity.
The most immediate visual signature of a Mamluk facade is ablaq masonry. Ablaq is the alternating use of different colored stone courses.
You see these striking horizontal stripes running across the exterior walls of almost every major Mamluk monument. Usually it is alternating bands of light-colored limestone and dark, nearly black basalt, or sometimes a dull pink stone.
Ablaq techniques actually originated in Syria, where basalt is naturally abundant during the Ayyubid period. The Mamluks adopted the technique and aggressively scaled it up, making it a mandatory feature of their monumental style.
The heavy contrast breaks up the visual mass of these towering walls and creates a strong rhythmic pattern along the street level.
Alongside the ablaq striping, the architecture is heavily branded. We have to remember the Mamluks are a military caste. Rank, regiment, and specific duties defined your entire identity and status. So patrons integrated heraldic blazons directly into the stonework.
Right, a blazon is a visual emblem denoting the patron's specific office or rank within the military hierarchy.
If the patron served as the sultan's cupbearer, you would see a carved cup prominently displayed on the building. If they were the master of the hunt, a horn or a lion.
These symbols were carved into massive stone roundels and embedded directly over the entrances. The building was literally branded with the patron's military resume.
But when we look at the broader decorative schemes, we hit a major religious constraint. Islamic religious architecture strictly adheres to aniconism.
This is the theological prohibition against creating realistic representations of human or animal forms, primarily to prevent idolatry.
A Mamluk patron could not commission a fresco of themselves, or carve a marble statue of the sultan, or depict scenes of their military victories on the walls of a mosque.
Because figurative art was prohibited in these spaces, the craftsmen channeled all of their creative artistic energy into two avenues: pure geometry, as we saw with the domes and muqarnas, and monumental typography.
Calligraphy ceased to be just writing. It was elevated to the highest form of architectural ornament. The scale of the calligraphy is hard to overstate.
They used monumental scripts, specifically Naskhi and Thuluth. These are characterized by tall, elegant vertical strokes and sweeping rhythmic horizontal lines.
We are not talking about small plaques next to a door. We are talking about massive, continuous bands of text, intricately carved into stone or deeply molded in stucco, that physically wrap around the entire perimeter of a building or a central courtyard.
The text itself was highly curated. The designers would seamlessly weave sacred Quranic verses together with the patron's explicit name, their military rank, and a long list of grand titles.
It physically intertwines the word of God with the authority of the state. You are reading a verse about divine mercy, and in the same continuous line of text, you are reading that Amir so-and-so is the sword of the Sultan and the defender of the faith.
It is an overwhelming sensory experience, particularly when you move inside. The interior spaces are heavily engineered to guide the eye.
At the human level, the lower walls are covered in dados. These are large panels of polychrome marble. The masons use deep, saturated reds, dark greens, and brilliant whites, cutting the marble into intricate geometric mosaics.
The marble serves a functional and aesthetic purpose. It provides a cool, highly polished, reflective surface at the ground level where the crowds gather.
But as your gaze moves upward, past the marble, the material reality of the room shifts. The heavy, colorful stone gives way to thick, intricately carved stucco in the upper transitional zones.
The stucco is carved with dense vegetal arabesques, endless scrolling patterns of vines, leaves, and palmettes.
Unlike the flat, reflective marble below, the deep relief carving of the stucco creates an intense interplay of light and shadow. It visually lightens the walls, creating a curated transition from the heavy, colorful, earthbound materials at the floor level to the complex, ethereal geometry of the dome above.
Up to this point, our discussion is focused almost entirely on sultans and military commanders. We are looking at a highly militarized, ultra-violent, deeply patriarchal society of foreign-born slave soldiers.
Yet the sources present a massive contradiction to this patriarchal dominance. Mamluk architecture features significant, highly influential patronage by women.
It is a vital and often overlooked dynamic of Mamluk society. To understand how women wielded such massive architectural and financial power, we have to look at the legal and social mobility of the odalisque, the female slave within the royal household.
The trajectory from enslaved captive to monumental patron is really something. An enslaved woman is brought into the harem. She might serve as a chambermaid, an attendant, or an entertainer.
But if she catches the attention of the sultan or a high-ranking emir and becomes his concubine, her status changes. And if she bears him a son, her legal reality transforms instantly. She attains the title of al-Walad, meaning mother of the child.
The moment she becomes al-Walid, she is no longer classified as property. She gains immense formal power within the court hierarchy. She is granted her own retinue, a dedicated state budget, and the legal right to amass independent wealth and property that she controls entirely and can pass down to her heirs.
Right, and if her son eventually ascends to the throne, she becomes the Walid Sultan, the Queen Mother, arguably one of the most powerful political figures in the empire.
But how does this wealth translate into architecture? If this is a patriarchal system, why wouldn't the husband simply control her assets?
This brings us back to the legal frameworks of Sharia law and the waqf system. Once a woman was emancipated or elevated to al-Walid, her financial independence was legally codified. Her husband could not dictate how she managed her endowments.
Furthermore, it was a common political strategy for powerful emirs, fearful of state confiscation, to actively transfer massive amounts of property and wealth into their wives' names.
Because the state might execute the emir and seize his assets, but they legally could not touch the private property of his wife.
Precisely. The women, operating with this secure, independent wealth, utilized the waqf system to commission major architectural projects. This allowed them to cement their own historical legacy, exert civic influence, and publicly demonstrate their piety on a monumental scale.
What is particularly notable is the geographic focus of this female patronage. While the men were fiercely competing for space in the crowded center of Cairo, many of these powerful women concentrated their endowments in Jerusalem.
Jerusalem held unparalleled theological prestige. It was a primary center of pilgrimage and scholarship, secondary only to Mecca and Medina. By building in Jerusalem, these wealthy princesses, dowagers, and emancipated concubines maximized the spiritual return on their investment while avoiding the hyper-congested, highly politicized real estate market of Cairo.
They funded massive infrastructure. They built madrasas, Sufi lodges known as zawiyas, and enormous mausoleums. The sources detail the Turbat al-Sit Tunjuk, a massive, highly ornate mausoleum built in Jerusalem for a powerful female patron.
They also funded ribbets. A rebbat in this context is crucial. These were large, secure residential lodges designed and funded specifically to host, feed, and protect female pilgrims traveling to the Holy City.
Right, it was a form of highly targeted, gender-specific civic charity operating on a massive scale.
But if we are discussing female architectural pioneers in this era, we have to look at the figure who effectively birthed the Mamluk dynasty, Shajarat al-Durr.
Shajarat al-Durr is a towering historical figure. Her origins are murky, likely Turkic or Armenian, but she began as an enslaved concubine to the last Ayyubid sultan, Asali Ayyub. She eventually became his wife.
During a massive crusader invasion of Egypt in 1249, her husband died unexpectedly.
The country is being invaded, and the ruler drops dead. That is a recipe for total collapse.
Instead of panicking, Shajar al-Durr concealed his death. She hid his body, forged his signature on state documents, and managed the war effort herself until her stepson could arrive to take the throne.
Following a series of assassinations, she briefly ruled Egypt in her own right as sultan, before strategically marrying a prominent Mamluk commander. She is the vital bridge connecting the fall of the Ayyubid dynasty to the rise of the Mamluk Empire.
And her architectural intervention established a blueprint that lasted for centuries. She commissioned a mausoleum for her deceased husband, but she made a radical decision.
She took the grand domed tomb and physically attached it directly to his religious school, the madrasa.
Prior to this, rulers were generally buried in isolated tombs or family enclosures. Shajar al-Durr explicitly linked the ruler's resting place to a public teaching institution.
She set the precedent that a mausoleum must be a highly visible, integrated part of civic life. Every subsequent Mamluk sultan who built a massive complex with an attached funerary dome on a busy street corner was following the architectural blueprint established by a formerly enslaved woman.
Her legacy perfectly illustrates the adaptability of the Mamluks. They were constantly absorbing influences, solving new problems, and adapting to their environment. And that adaptation was not just temporal, it was deeply regional.
Cairo was the political and financial epicenter where they built the largest, most ornate structures. But Mamluk power spanned across the Levant and the Mediterranean, and their architecture shifted dramatically based on local materials, older traditions, and specific regional threats.
If we look outside of Egypt, the regional signatures are highly distinct. In Cairo, as we discussed, they rapidly transitioned to fine, pale limestone. But if you travel to Damascus in Syria, the geological reality dictates a different aesthetic.
The environment in Syria provides heavy access to basalt.
Basalt is a hard, dark, volcanic rock. Because it was locally abundant, the Syrian architects used it extensively. This made the ablaq striping, the contrasting bands of light and dark stone, much sharper and more pronounced than in Cairo.
The Syrian builders also maintained older, more conservative Ayyubid traditions.
Give me a specific example of how the Syrian style differed from the Cairo style.
Look at the Muqarnas. In Cairo, the Muqarnas carvings eventually became incredibly sharp, complex, and angular. In Damascus, the Masons favored a softer, rounded profile for their Muqarnas niches.
Furthermore, the minarets in Syria tended to be sturdy and square, lacking the soaring, multi-tiered, heavily carved cylindrical spires that dominated the Cairene skyline.
And if you move further north to Aleppo, the architecture takes on an entirely different posture. Aleppo was a northern frontier city. It was constantly threatened by invasions from the Mongols and later the Timurids.
Additionally, it sits in a highly active seismic zone. The architecture reflects a state of constant anxiety. The buildings in Aleppo are noticeably heavier. The masonry is thicker and less delicate.
The patrons focused less on towering minarets and intricate stone filigree and heavily prioritized robust, defensible infrastructure. They poured their WAC funds into expanding massive citadels, reinforcing city walls, and building heavily fortified public baths and commercial caravanserais that could withstand both earthquakes and sieges.
We see that defensive priority mirrored on the Mediterranean coast in Alexandria. The primary threat there was not a land invasion, but naval assaults from European powers.
The most famous Mamluk structure in Alexandria is the Quaite-based citadel, constructed between 1477 and 1480. It is a massive, squat, heavily fortified castle jutting out into the harbor.
What is remarkable about the Quaite-based citadel is its location. It was built directly upon the ruined footprint of the ancient Pharos lighthouse, one of the original 7 wonders of the ancient world, which had collapsed after a series of massive earthquakes.
The Mamluk engineers did not clear the site. They actively mined the ruins, ingeniously incorporating the massive, fallen granite blocks of the ancient Greek lighthouse directly into the defensive walls of their new Islamic fortress.
It is the ultimate act of architectural recycling. But if we want to examine the most complex, pragmatic example of Mamluk adaptation, we really have to look closely at Jerusalem.
They did not conquer Jerusalem and level the city to build massive, standalone monuments like they did in Cairo. The architectural strategy in Jerusalem is best described as infill.
Jerusalem was an incredibly dense, ancient, urban tapestry. It was choked with Roman, Byzantine, Umayyad, and Crusader ruins. The Mamluk architects approached the city with extreme pragmatism.
They did not force the city to adapt to their buildings. They adapted their buildings to the existing ruins.
How exactly did they execute that infill?
They would locate the heavy stone foundations of a ruined Crusader hall, and rather than tearing it up, they would use those foundations to support the walls of a new Mamluk madrasa.
They built over, around, and directly into the existing historical fabric. They surgically inserted their WAC-funded schools and lodges into the narrow alleys, weaving their presence into the city without destroying its ancient layout.
The sources highlight the Cotton Merchant's Gate, constructed by the Governor Tanquiz in 1336, as the masterpiece of this urban connectivity. It is a grandiose, deeply ornamented stone portal.
But its genius is what it connects. It physically links the sacred elevated space of the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound directly down into the bustling, noisy commercial vitality of the Cotton Market Street.
It acts as an architectural valve, binding the religious mandate of the Mamluk state directly to the commercial economic engine that generated the WAC revenues. It perfectly encapsulates the Mamluk approach to the built environment, highly functional, deeply integrated into the existing reality, and unashamedly monumental.
So, we have traced the trajectory of the Mamluks, a caste of enslaved, foreign-born captives who overthrew their masters, halted the Mongols, and took control of the Middle East.
They lacked bloodline legitimacy, so they utilized unprecedented wealth from the global spice monopoly, exploited the legal loopholes of the WAC trust system, and harnessed absolute geometric and engineering brilliance to permanently weave their legacy into the stone of Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, and Jerusalem.
They turned the massive disadvantage of their outsider status and the intense volatility of their political system into an engine of unprecedented architectural innovation. They built because they had to.
The human impulse to conquer anxiety with concrete and steel is fascinating to consider. We see this today. Modern societies still use monumental architecture, a massive corporate headquarters dominating a skyline, a sprawling museum complex, to project an illusion of immortality and stability during periods of rapid economic or social upheaval.
And that leads to a complex final realization regarding the financial mechanisms we explored. The Mamluk elite built these breathtaking charitable structures largely to shield their private wealth from state confiscation via the waqf system.
Which leaves us with a provocative consideration regarding the nature of charity and wealth hoarding. We look at these magnificent hospitals, schools, and water dispensaries, and we classify them as the pinnacle of civic philanthropy.
But if the entire system was fundamentally driven by an elite class desperately creating untaxable legal shelters to protect their family fortunes, it challenges our understanding of legacy. It begs the question, how much of the world's most celebrated, enduring public infrastructure is actually the byproduct of private wealth desperately trying to outrun the reach of the state?
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.